Prayer. Father, again, thank you for your word, and in particular this section of Scripture. Help me to do an excellent job with it. And again, help us to see that it records history. And again, it's not a science document in any way, shape, or form. You're not explaining any of the things that would fill a geology book. But again, you tell us truth, and from that truth, we should be able to see the fingerprints of what has happened as a result of our sin and the destruction of the world. And I thank you that even in the midst of the fact that we A, live in a curse following the garden, and B, live in a world that was destroyed by the flood, we still find beauty in it. And so we ask you just to remind us that again, through this judgment, you always provide a way out, and it always comes through you. And we just pray that we turn to you as we look at this material today. In your Son's name, amen. All righty, so we're into our next Toledo, what became of Noah, 6:9 through 9:29. And so by means of a big picture or a review in the form of an overview, we left 5:1 through 6:8 with the setup to sit there and say that why is the flood coming? And again, this is one of those questions you have to ask. Literally, God will sit there and say, I'm going to destroy everything that has breath in it, except for 8 people in a boat full of animals, right? That kind of judgment is really, really severe. So what is it that predicates that? And of course, that's the 6:1 through 6:8. The Nephilim is the basic problem God is going to go off and solve. Which is again why later on in Numbers, when we see them again, God is basically saying to Israel at that time when you go into the land, utterly wipe these people out. Same ideas come back and forth. Again, we talked about last week that we would see this big picture of the overview, and again, this is just timelines of people, the 10 generations that come through this, right? Here is the flood, and so again, there's Methuselah's line, and it basically ends in the year of the flood. Whether or not he's killed by the flood, not recorded, not material to the conversation. Methuselah also has a kind of some other aspects to it that's interesting in his life, right? You'll notice he's the only one who sees recorded in Scripture a son died. And so again, we have no aspects of really what's going on with this. I think what's interesting about this is when you take a look at this, 9 generations lived together for 56 years during the antediluvian period. That's my lifetime, right? 10 after the flood, which we'll look at later when we do the Tower of Babel, etc. 10 generations, so the entire body of people will live together for 118 years. Now, again, what's interesting is Shem, who's going to be born here with Noah at the end of this time. And of course, Shem is actually born back here, okay? So we'll find out that Noah's in the 600s when the flood begins. His sons are born in his 500s, right? So they've lived during this period of time for more than 100 years. Shem is basically dies when Isaac is 50 years old.
That's crazy.
Right? So therefore, from Adam to Abraham, there are just 3 degrees of separation. It would be like hearing something from your grandfather, essentially, right? So it's just really interesting stuff, I think. Lamech, of course, is the one who names his son Rest, and interestingly enough, God takes him before he sees the flood. You could sit there and say, he comes in his rest, right? His age, 777, always 7s are always interesting numbers, right? And so you just have to wonder about that. So what became of Noah? Genesis 6:9 says, these are the family records of Noah. This is that word Toledot, this is what became of Noah. So that's the title of this section. Then he opens up with this next sentence. Noah was a righteous man, blameless among his contemporaries. Noah walked with God. Righteous, the word for righteous, again, we'll start off with walk with God and sort of set that aside a little bit. Obviously, we talked last week with walked with God because who walked with God? This dude, Enoch, right? He's the first person outside of Adam and Eve who we're told walked with God, right? Well, we have our second person here in Noah. Noah walks with God as well. So again, I told you it's absolutely easy to do. It's absolutely fun to do. Go look through the Bible for all the places that talk about people who walk with God. But let's move on to Sadiq, right? Righteous. Again, this is an adjective that describes one who is upright or just. The basic root of this means conformity to an ethical or a moral standard. And so Sadiq pertains to a person who lives in accordance with the proper or right standards. Now again, interestingly enough, this is not the word that is used in the Cain and Abel story. When God sits there and says, if you do what is right, that is not Sadiq, okay? Which is why I sit there and say that a better translation, if you do what is well, or I wanted to go even further to sit there and say, if you improve, then that is the intent of that word. Sadiq is not used very often in Genesis. In fact, Noah is the only person in the book of Genesis to whom this word is applied. Think about that. I am the God of who?
Isaac.
Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? God never applies that word to them. Okay? Now, Abraham will use the word repeatedly in chapter 18 as he's making an argument for what? Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Will you not save it for 50 righteous people, right? This is the word that he bandies about in that conversation. But that word, again, is never applied to anybody else specifically in Genesis. I find that fascinating. Okay, Tanim, blameless, okay? This is if you look at the entire, it's used a boatload in the Old Testament, right? Half of the references are in Leviticus and Numbers. And again, it basically deals with passages stating that animals to be offered as sacrifices must be tamim, they must be blameless. Now again, you ask yourself, well, how does an animal be blameless, right? In fact, we're going to see this word blameless applied to the animals in a quote here in just a second. What blameless really goes off and means is to say spotless, without blemish, the idea of something being complete, full, or whole. So don't bring me your lame sacrifices, right? Don't bring me your animals that are missing or sickly in some way, shape, or form. So again, this description of Noah as somebody who's what? He's complete, right? He's whole or full before God. And of course, Noah is in some strong company. If you go off and take a look at Ezekiel 14:14 and a couple other passages that come out of Ezekiel, God is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem that is for sure to come. There's no denying that this is going to go off and happen. And he makes this argument, God makes this argument, even if these three men, and then he names them, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they would only rescue themselves by their righteousness. This is the declaration of the Lord. And he goes on and repeats that if these three men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they could only save themselves and not their family. And of course, in this period of time, Noah doesn't just save himself, but he saves what? At least some of his family, right? His three offspring for sure, right? So again, we get this idea that Noah is somebody of very, very high character, right? A real true hero of the Bible and some of this, right? Now finally, I think we could add to this, he is obedient. If you want to write these down and take a look at this, in 6:22, God basically records, or Moses records, that Noah demonstrates obedience to God's command. 6:22, Noah did this. He did everything God commanded him. In 7:5, 7:9, and 7:16, Noah did everything that the Lord commanded him. In 8:18, so Noah, along with his sons, his wife, and his wives, came out in obedience to God's command to finally leave the ark. What we get is all through this section, every time God asks Noah to do it, he does it exactly as God has commanded him to go off and do. Genesis 6:10, Noah fathered 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now again, 8 people enter the ark, right? But interesting enough, the wives are not named. But what I think is interesting is this detail is something we pass over, right? Notice that when we saw the previous section, 6:1 through 7, that the sin is sexual in nature. The sons of God and the daughters of women, blah, 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 they're creating this other race of superior, renowned people, etc., etc. So we already know that the sin is sexual in nature. We've already been introduced to another Lamech who is what? A polygamist, right? And here we have Noah and his sons who are what? Monogamous. Now again, I don't know that again, this is pretty late. You look at the years where the sun shows up, it's in the late 70s, early hundreds, right? These guys are born in Noah's 500th year, right? Now obviously they weren't all, unless they're twins or triplets in this case, right? Which conceivably could be the case, right? And again, I actually looked at that to say 500 years old when nobody basically says I'm going to go out on a limb and say they were triplets. But I mean, you look at the year 500, unless it's just some big rounding sort of a deal, it's conceivable they're all three triplets. Now,
It's conceivable.
I wasn't going there. It is what it is. Now, if he had any other children, they're not mentioned. But I would sit there and say one of the reasons why I think these three are included in the deal is because, again, they also demonstrate what? This small bit of adherence to a law that doesn't exist on the books, but exists in God's plan. Does that make sense?
So the sons helped him build the ark.
Sure, why not?
100 years of
120 years of ark building labor, possibly.
and no children.
And they didn't have any children, apparently.
Isn't that something?
Well, again, how long do you wait to have kids when you live 900 years? You got lots of time, right? There's no,
And if all of your time is spent building an art project, maybe
you go home and you're like, honey, I'm the one with the headache. The idea, though, behind this again too is to sit there and say your biological clock here is much more like a celestial clock of some sort, right? So that's a long time in the future. Now, moving on to, I want to make sure you understand the motifs of this story. We're gonna basically do this week and next week on this section. So we're gonna kind of set up the main thrust of where we're going of this section 6, 7, 8, 9. But we basically want to make sure you understand there are two main motifs in this. The one is the judgment of sinners. The second is that deliverance from that judgment. Okay. The deliverance is interesting. I think this is worth understanding here. The deliverance is made known through what? Direct revelation. God speaks to Noah, right? Second, it is prior, meaning he gives them what? It's 120 years. And then I'm going to wipe these people out, right? And then finally he does what? Here are the provisions. You need to build this, but I'm going to do this, right? Now, does that sound familiar? Right? It's exactly what John chapter 1 says, right? Here, it's direct revelation, it is a prior announcement, and then it's what? A special provision. God works the same way through all of history. And then, of course, he sits there and says, here's how the judgment's going to come. It's going to go be by a flood, so commissioned to build the ark and to preserve life, right? And then there was this contrast between those who rebel and Noah who walks with God. And we saw that from the previous section as well as in this one, right? Unrighteous acts lead to judgment, but not immediately, as God makes provisions for the righteous, right? And we see Peter pick up this same theme. I don't think that God's patience is anything other than just what? Hoping that all come to belief. Faithfulness is the proper response to God's graciousness. And of course, Noah exercises a great amount of faith, because it's got to be a weird deal to sit there and say, here, I want you to go off and do this. And there's a lot of specificity in this. And then salvation comes from one. Now, this is a theme that's repeated in Genesis and ultimately through the one man, Jesus Christ, right? There is one name under heaven by which men may be saved. That's it. And so all this stuff, again, these themes, this idea of salvation in the New Testament has all its roots in Genesis. In 6:17, he says, I understand that I am bringing a flood waters on the earth to destroy every creature under heaven with breath of life in it. Everything on earth will perish, right? Now, I will sit there and suggest that modern man cannot accept that this is from a good God. And so this quote, the legend of animals going into the ark 2 by 2 is charming, but the moral story of Noah is appalling. God took a dim view of humans, so he, with the exception of one family, drowned a lot of them, including children and also, for good measure, the rest of them, presumably blameless animals as well. Of course, irritated theologians will protest that we don't take the book of Genesis literally anymore, but that's my whole point. We pick and choose which bits of scriptures to believe and which bits to write off as symbols or allegories. Such picking and choosing is a matter of personal decision, just as much or as little as the atheist's decision to follow this moral precept. That was also a personal decision without an absolute foundation. If one of these is morality flying by the seat of its pants, so is the other. Richard Dawkins from his book, The God Delusion. Now, I think at least Dawkins is being consistent in his statement here, right? He recognizes his own morality, which is based on his atheism, is relative, okay? And he points out correctly that if theologians pick and choose which bits of scriptures to believe, then they too are actually saying that truth is relative, to be decided by who?
The reader.
The reader. Human beings, right? Is this important? As we think about this and move forward, is this important, this discussion, yes or no?
Yes.
Why?
Well, if that's the case, then why read the rest of the book?
Right.
I mean,
Wouldn't it be interesting, right, if you could sit there and say this, and then you looked at this story and you said to yourself, okay, how many times is it referenced in the rest of the scripture? And it was never referenced again in the rest of scripture. Would it change your opinion?
So it provides a foundation for how we think, we collectively think going forward. This is the basis of why I think the way I think. And everything is built upon it.
Yeah. This is a foundation stone, right? This idea
This
that
becomes
God,
your absolute worldview.
it does, right? But what are the two components of what I'm saying? So let me ask you the question one more time. If this story was never referenced again in the rest of scripture, would it still be important?
Yes.
where it's quoted as history, not something out of the blue.
That's right.
And oh yeah, it was an old story we don't
Every
reference. But
world
when you
culture
have
has
Christ
it.
and everybody else referencing it,
You quote it just as simple as fact, right? Is that right? Now, to your point,
Every world culture has a flood narrative,
why is that?
because it happened.
That's exactly right.
And
Which,
most of them have virgin birth stories as well.
yeah, which is what we're going to pick up on every culture having the flood story here, and we're building toward what comes in the Tower of Babel section and stuff of this, right? But again, I think this is important because again, it goes back to what? This point, whoops, dummy, up, not down, down, down. It comes back to this. Judgment of sinners, deliverance from judgment. These are two of the foundations of everything that we build all of Scripture understanding God around, right? But if God doesn't exist, do either of those two things matter?
I think too, what contorts us a bit is we're so close to the end of our mortality. He was 500 and they lived hundreds of years. They didn't think much about mortality because they saw it as a transition.
Over a very long period of time.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, exactly right. As opposed to us who may be transitioning over a couple of years, something like that, in a terrible case. But I think this is my point of this, is to sit there and say that at the end of the day, if I don't have the flood story, then this all starts to fall away. That's Peter's point. When he sits there and says, God knows, if God can rescue these people, then he knows how to do what? Hold the sinners to account. The argument works in both directions, right? But if God doesn't exist, if this story isn't true, then everything on that falls out. I don't have to worry about it anymore, right?
Well, and beyond God's existence, Dawkins is also arguing what kind of God is he, which is interesting.
Exactly right, because he's arguing he's what?
Bad or
He's a
evil.
bad, evil God, because why? He wiped out little kids.
And animals.
Blameless
Yeah,
animal.
and everybody knows puppies are cute. Why would you kill a puppy? But, well, see now, because cats make sense. But, but yeah, now you're getting into
Yeah.
serious territory. We're talking about wiping out little rabbits, right? Anyway, so the idea is, I think, I want to ask you this follow-up question then.
I just wanted to tell you, I used to like you, but.
Let me explain to you the concept of a seeing eye cat.
In physics class, we all have a sticker on our calculator, and I still have it. And the reason I got a sticker on my calculator is not because I got 100, not because of anything. It was because he said, and now we're skinning cats. And who doesn't love skinning cats? So everybody who raised their hand got a sticker on their calculator.
Yeah, so we talk about, even Beverly says, I have a sticker. And again, it's like, you get a sticker and it's just for the most odd reasons. But they're precious, so everybody likes gold stars, you know? So, now, moving forward and away from this, let me ask this final question. If the flood is so important, then why is it always portrayed as a children's story? Even in church. Why is it always portrayed as a children's story?
Because there's cute animals in it.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
Right. That's exactly what I was thinking about, right? My son's name is Noah, right? Some of you know that, some of you don't, but my son's name is Noah, so not shockingly, he got a lot of Noah-themed stuff growing up, including this little boat, wooden boat that you drag with a string, and it had cute little animals painted in it, right? That's our image of Noah's Ark. Does that jive with reality? Again, why is it always portrayed as a children's story? Think through the logic of it.
We don't like to think about judgment
Yes.
being poured down on us
Yes.
and immediate death, immediate judgment.
Okay.
But
When's the last time-
don't you want to teach your kids to read it from the perspective of Noah, not from the perspective of everyone who's dying?
Okay, explain that.
Well, you want your kids to see that they're being delivered by God in the ark, not that they're being judged
Yes.
necessarily.
Depends on the kid.
I was gonna say.
It's for a different person.
There's the parental versus the
Yeah.
children's view, right?
What they taught Sarah, they didn't teach you.
That's my point. I taught Sarah something completely different. No, I think one of the things is, let's go back to picking up on your point, right? Is to sit there and say that there's no need for judgment, right? When's the last time you seriously looked at the Greek gods? Spend any time reading about them, their stories.
High school.
High school, right? When were you introduced to them? Earlier than that, right? But they're not a part of our lives in any way, shape, or form, and we lump them in our minds categorically as what? Myths. They're just stories, right? This is what happens with Noah's Ark. It just gets lumped. You know, it's something I covered when I was in Sunday school, because why? Well, it's a lot of fun. We talk about the story, and then we send the kid home with what? Little marshmallow, shaped animals. Wasn't that fun? Mom and Dad are those are so cute, blah, 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 right? And because it's cute and fluffy, what happens to it?
It's dismissed.
It's dismissed, exactly right. The story is just left as one of those things that's prior to Abraham, which means what? All of Genesis 1 through 11 is just in the category of mythology.
It's watered down.
So, for our guests, if you like puns or like to throw out puns, feel free. We attract those kind of people.
Thomas, one thing I think about it, there are evangelical Old Testament scholars that believe that everything before the Babylonian captivity is pretty much right.
Yeah, exactly right.
And John Walton is one of them.
Yeah. You guys?
Wake up.
She would have been late for class. So thankfully Bob got you up. So you say that again.
So there are evangelical Old Testament scholars that believe essentially the Old Testament was written during the Babylonian captivity. So it may be based on true myths, but it's myths nonetheless.
Myths nonetheless, exactly right.
So, for instance, the end of Deuteronomy talks about Moses' death. He didn't write that, probably Joshua did. But
Yeah.
they think it was all recompiled during the Babylonian exile. So
Exactly.
all of this then, you go back far enough, it's mythology too.
Yeah, yeah. It is. We're just counting back to those other ancient Near East cultures. We're just sort of documenting the foundational myths of our culture.
Yeah.
Exactly right. But that is not how it's presented, and so that's why we're going to go off and take a look at it. I think we're looking at a literary approach to Genesis. Why we're looking at the chapters and trying to make sure that we understand the sense of why these things are in where they are in the story, and why there's repetition sometime, etc. Why they're such long chapters. We're going to get to the longest chapter in Genesis. It's probably one of the least interesting things, and it's completely redundant, but again, it becomes important when you understand it's from a literary perspective. But again, this story is chiastic in structure. What do I mean by chiastic? I don't have a word, but it's easy to do like an X, right? The Greek word for chi at X, right, means that the story works its way in and it works its way back out. And so what we're going to go off and do with that is to say, is there a chiastic structure here? And the answer is yes, a giant chiastic structure, right? Up there at the top? Fantastic, already did the X, too bad. Too bad, so sad. I'm not gonna show it in the form of an X, I'm gonna show it in the form of a little different way of doing this, right? So again, if you look at chapter 6, 11 through 13, God resolves to destroy all of mankind. In 8, 21 through 22, God resolves to do what? Not destroy all of mankind. This is the basic format of a chiastic structure. Noah builds an ark in 6, 14 through 22. He lands and he does what? First thing he does? He builds an altar. The Lord commands the remnant to enter the ark. Of course, he, in 8, 15 through 19, commands the remnant to leave the ark. The flood begins in 7, 10 through 16. The earth begins to dry in 8, 6 through 14. The flood prevails for 150 days. Mountains are covered, 7, 17 through 24. The flood recedes 150 days, and the mountains are visible, 8, 1b through 5. What's the importance of a chiastic structure? Why does it exist? And by the way, it's used in a lot of literature, including a movie you guys may not even have thought about being chiastic, but The Empire Strikes Back was specifically written with a chiastic. It's for memory, okay? That's one, because it's, again, I only have to basically memorize half the plot points to understand the other half of the plot points, correct?
It points to the most important thing,
Which is
the center.
the creamy filling, right?
Yep.
Exactly right. And of course, in the movie, The Empire Strikes Back, what is the chiastic moment? Luke, I am your father. The entire movie is built around that one phrase. Okay? You work your way into that plot point and you work your way out. That's the entire point of the movie. The entire point of this book is what? 8:1a. God remembered Noah, as well as all the wildlife and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. Interesting phrase, but that's the point of the entire thing here. God remembered Noah. Now, of course, God is acting on his previous commitment back in 6:18, where he sits there and says, I will establish my covenant with you. Now again, that's also the first time we've heard that term. God acting in form of a covenant with somebody, right? There's no explanation of what that establishment looks like. We'll have our first example of that with Abram. But again, what's interesting is he remembered, God remembered, as though God could forget. I love it, right? But it's this lovely way of basically God sitting there saying, oh, it's like, oh man, you know, somewhere on all the waters, there he is, Noah. In the midst of all the destruction, I remember Noah. There he is, right? And again, God is compassionate to all of the creatures in the boat, not just Noah.
He was probably grieved by the death of them all as well.
Right? Because again, from Noah's perspective, we talked about, this is why I started with the timeline. These people on the boat knew how many people that are important to our story. Almost all of them. Back to Abraham, literally back to Father Adam. Right? They're all gone. There's no hope that again, when God sat there and said, hey, I'm going to wipe out everything that has breath in it, you might think to yourself, maybe, does that really mean everything? You know, sort of a deal? Yeah, I mean, after you're 150 days on the flood, and you're watching what's going on, you're like, how much hope do you have anybody survived?
Just a quick, that word remember is something when God thinks about that, he acts on it.
Yeah. That's another fun word to take a look and do some word space.
Yeah, so it's not just, oh, look, Noah's out in the water.
Yeah, exactly. No, it's right. You're exactly right. There's a movement toward, because that's why I point out that it's 8a or 8:1a, because 8:1b is what? He starts to move. He's going to take the action, exactly right. Now again, I just want you to think about this, because again, this is something I think that's sort of lost on us a little bit. How am I doing on time? Excellently. All right, great. So 7:4, we're just gonna go through some of the sequence of the flood, because again, I want you to understand, there's a great amount of specificity to this, right? Why use such language? I'm hoping that you guys read this, because we're not reading these 3 chapters, right? Why is there such specificity in the language used in 7 and 8? Any ideas?
God planned it.
God planned it. He knew exactly, again, to your point, which again, you did all the stuff with the stars, God knew exactly when things were going to happen. He mathematically worked it all out. So certainly he planned it, and everything happens according to his plan exactly. So I agree with that.
It lends a credibility to the historicity of it.
Yes, that's where I'm going with it. Exactly right, okay? If you're a good writer, you want to do what? Include concrete, specific details, because they do what? Paint a picture. Makes it more real for the reader. And that's the whole point of biblical narrative. We've talked about that biblical narrative like Genesis isn't just what happened, it's what happens. The main character of this story is still with us. Who is that? God, right? Who's planned all this for them is planning for it for us. Right? The same things are still happening. And so we're supposed to be able to vicariously live through this approach, which is to your point of saying, I look at Noah, who spends 150 days in the boat and who's grieving over the loss of all life. You're supposed to feel that, right? Now again, if you ask a liar a question, what kind of response do you generally get? No, what kind? No, I'm not saying. Obviously, it's a lie. I just said if you ask a liar, they get what kind of response?
He said lawyer.
Oh, I said okay. I said liar, not lawyer. Sorry. Same thing. Same difference for all you lawyers. No. A liar, L-I-A-R.
He's not gonna give you specifics, he's gonna divert to, yeah.
Generally speaking, right? Estimates, right? It'll generally be shorter. It's more bare bones, because why? The greater the specificity, the easier it is to do what? To pick it apart. Exactly right. Okay? So again, which is why interesting when you go back and look at those ancient Near East cultures versions of the flood, do they have this kind of level of specificity? None of them do, right?
Well, they're descendants of Shem and
Ham and Japheth.
Yeah. So the flood story came from Noah.
Yep.
So why would they omit the specificity?
We'll get to that when we get to again. We're setting a lot of this stuff up for what comes next. So yeah, I just want you to keep that in mind. Right, these things are happening, right? And then I think there's one other thing that's important as you go off and you sit through this thing. So again, he's going to make it rain for 40 days and 40 nights. Have we ever observed anywhere on the planet where it's rained for 40 days and 40 nights?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Now, so the type of rain that comes out of this, right, is the word Geshem, which we have in Texas, which are these horrific downpours, inches per hour of rain, right? This isn't Seattle's misty day sort of deal. I appreciate your emphasis on that, right?
Give you an answer.
Exactly. So Renee and I have been to 2 of the wettest places in the United States, the Akamai Swamp in Kauai and Ketchum, Alaska or something like this, right? Only one of the places was actually wet. Alaska did have some rain. But I mean, again, this doesn't exist. Why? Because when we read the word rain, we take it back to what we understand today. Rain happens for what reason?
Water the crops.
No, not to because the air, there's a condensation of the moisture in the air that falls to the ground, right? So that would mean there'd have to be what? A boatload of water vapor for it to rain that hard for 40 days and 40 nights, right? So that's a clue. Now, he goes on to sit there and says in this second month, on the 17th day of the month, he's very specific about this. On that day, all the sources of the vast watery depths burst open. The floodgates of the sky were opened, and rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights, right? This is the interesting part. It starts with what? The sky or the ground? The ground. It starts with the ground. So we set this up. I'm borrowing this from Unit 2. We covered this when we did Day 2. Genesis 1, 6 through 10, this idea that God creates an expanse. It separates the waters above from the waters below. This picture right here has this idea of this is the waters above and below, and then this crust, this rocky, this hammered out material. Now again, the idea behind this is that what hydroplate would suggest is that that rocky is a substance we're all familiar with, which is called granite. Granite is an enigma. It's a type of rock we cannot reproduce in the lab in any way, shape, or form. Okay? If you take granite and melt it, you end up with something called rhyolite. Okay? We can recreate marble. We can make a lot of fake rocks. We cannot make granite. And the reason is because granite's made up of at least 4 different materials that all have different melt points and all have different specific gravities. So if you were just to melt all these things, throw them into a mold of some sort, would large grain granite come out? No, it never does. That's interesting. Why is it this unique rock? Well, because it was made on day 2 for a specific reason. Granite also has other unique properties to it. Anybody ever have usually it's a barbecue grill or one of those outdoor heaters that we click the button, it makes a bang, and then the flame comes on? What are you banging when you push the button? Is it electronic? Huh?
A flint,
It's not flint.
Is it electric?
Piezoelectric. It's a piece of granite. And when granite is struck, it generates an electrical charge. The electrical charge is important, which is, again, remember people would ask and sit there and say, I said, how do you generate elements heavier than iron? And people will say, well, they're stellar furnaces. No, they're not. There's too much energy, the wrong kind of energy, not enough neutrons, et cetera, et cetera. But all of a sudden, if you go off and take a look at granite's properties, it basically can conduct electricity just like the air. In fact, it does a better job in a lot of ways of conducting electricity. And because of the way that it conducts electricity, generates forces that do what? Bind things together. And how we're able to create heavier elements in the lab is through electrical magnetism, the power of electromagnetism, as opposed to anything else. All of this stuff, granite is absolutely critical to everything that we see around the world about us. And yet again, we just dismiss it as, well, I don't know what it is in Genesis 1, 6 through 10. Now I'm giving you just all this little bit to highlight, because what I want to go off and sit there and say is that I know somebody specifically at this church who worked at this church who we lost to the lies of science. And I have an elder who has a granddaughter, who basically sits there and says, well, I don't believe in God, but I do believe in science. We have a whole bunch of people who are basically going off and saying what? This is just myth and history, a history of some sort. It's important from a cultural perspective. It has no bearing on my life whatsoever. And yet God has given us everything in here to go off and do what? To deduce the basic processes that explain the world that we have around us. And our science is way, way better than theirs. Okay? Because at least it's consistent. And so again, I've left a bunch of notes in my on this page if you want to go off and follow through with it, right? But the idea is that one of the things I think was real important we said back then was when God creates this situation where you've got a granite crust sitting between 2 bodies of water that literally spans the entire globe, he does not call that good. Because why? It's inherently unstable. That situation is not going to remain in equilibrium. So what happens? Well, the day 3, there's a buckling of this, and dry land rises out of the surface water, and of course that's where he then goes off and prepares plants, animals, and the rest of the story moves forward. And day 3 gets 2 goods, where day 2 got none. Well, if you've got this water trapped underneath this granite crust, and don't think this is just a few miles, this could be as many as 60 miles of granite, okay? This could be a mile or more of water underneath there. What's going to happen to it as the moon is going around the earth doing what? Tidally pulling this back and forth, it's stretching like a rubber band. Something's going to happen to a rubber band if you just play with it all day, right? It's going to snap, right? And that's what the suggestion with hydroplate theory is at some point, exactly when God said it was going to, because he knows engineering like nobody else, right? it snaps. And again, if you go back and you take a look, and you can do this using Google Earth, and you basically trace the 46,000 mile undersea mountain range that we call what we call for us between Europe and the United States, the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. But it's the longest mountain range in the entire world. It's completely underwater. And you trace it back, and you start from, this time I will borrow the marker, if it's an actual marker. Yes. Does it say dry erase? It does, great. Out in the Indian Ocean, you have a line of mountains that go like this, and then a line that starts like that. If stuff is spreading, again, we're told that these things are spreading like this, right? That's why these mountains are forming, right? Then how does that work? Right there. What spreading mechanism accounts for the 90-degree aspect of that? But if you start there and you trace the lines backwards in both directions, right? So start here and start and go backwards, what you find out is that this crack probably started in the Siberian area, or for us today, what we call Siberia. And then it races 3 miles a second through the granite crust. And this is where it ends, as it runs into the tension crack already created, and the rupture is complete. And now all you have to do is what? Let the pressure out. And of course the fountain's water go up, and then what? Extreme rain, because not all that has enough power to leave the atmosphere. But what's fascinating to me about this picture is it explains so much, because all it is it takes one assumption. And the assumption is what? Day 2 happened like this. And from that point, everything is just what? Gravity. Gravity accounts for everything else. And using this simple system, you can explain comets, and asteroids, to frozen mammoths, to why there are petrified forests where there are, to why we have 365.25 days in our year, to why the moon looks the way the moon looks, and on and on and on and on, including radioactivity on the earth, etc. It's fascinating, because the simpler the explanation and the more broadly it covers something, the more likely it is to be what? True. E equals mc squared. It's understandable, easy to grasp, not something complex. God is a God of simplicity. And again, this is a simple structure that explains where we're at. Now, again, the flood starts coming up and continues, right? It rises and lifts the boat up, and then you see what? It surges higher on the earth. Now, this is what? For 40 days, and then what's happening? The water is still rising after the rain has stopped. You'll notice it sat there and said what? 40 days and 40 nights of rain, but how long did the flood waters increase? 110 days of water still pouring out of the great deep. Okay? The water surged for 150 years, right? Where's all the water coming from? It's got to be coming from underground, right? The fountains of the deep. So, in the first chapter of 8, then serves as 2 purposes, right? We have that statement, God remembered Noah. And then immediately after this, we have what? God caused a wind to pass over the earth, and the water began to subside, right? Now, what's interesting about this, right, is that this idea of wind is the same word for spirit. The same word for spirit that we saw in Genesis 1:2. Flood waters covered the earth, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters. Here we have what? The same word again, over what? Waters. Now again, there will be some geological reasons that this is actually just wind, because it's the same word. You have to use context to determine what it is. So you can make a reason to sit there and say that there was a type of wind that would have passed over the earth for geological reasons, but I find it interesting that we are back to the beginning.
I've noticed a lot of places, at least in the Old Testament, where wind is just used, right? Like the plague of locusts, he caused the wind to bring all the locusts in, and then he said, is that the same word probably, or?
Ruach.
Okay.
Yeah, it is.
Interesting.
8:2-3. Notice this, again, the specificity of why I kept all this here. The source of the watery depths of the floodgates of the sky were closed. The rain from the sky stopped. The water steadily receded from the earth, and at the end of 150 days, the water had decreased significantly. Notice here, 8:4-5, the ark came to rest in the 7th month on the 17th day of the month. How many months prior did the flood start?
5.
5. Okay, 5 times 30 is what? 150. So how long is a month?
30 days.
30 days, keep that in mind, right? He lands the boat on what? Ararat. The water continued to recede until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were visible. Now this is interesting to me, right? Is that again, where I'm sort of always was left with this idea that Noah's Ark just sort of lands on Ararat and they just crack the door open, they hop out, right? They don't. I mean, they're sitting, their boat is no longer bobbing in the ocean. They're grounded on Ararat, right? But the water is still a mess and things are still happening, okay? So I think all of this basically happens in one day, okay? And so 150 days after the flood begins, the boat grounds itself on Ararat, and it marks the halfway point. So let's ask this question: how do you fold stone? How does stone fold into 90-degree patterns? These are people, just to give you some sense of scale, look at the way that stone is formed. This is in Wales. Those are chevron patterns. It's like, I mean, again, I love this. God just does this stuff, right? It's like, okay, I can not just fold it in 90 degrees this way. I'll fold it back again. Just to make sure that you understand. That's pretty strange. Again, what are the natural, how is limestone formed according to our 8th grade geology class? Shallow seas,
Sedimentary.
slow accumulation of plant life, and more specifically, sea life of some sort. Would any of those processes account for that? In no way, shape, or form, right? Again, it's large in scale. This is in Canada, so maybe the Kellys can tell us where that's at, right? But again, look at the size of this amount of fold on that, right? And again, here, again, the zigzagging folds of a mountain. This isn't a small parking lot exhibit. This is ginormous, thousands of feet. Again, this is not just bent 90 degrees, it's bent straight up. Okay, these layers all accumulated one individual grain at a time and self-sorted themselves horizontally. It's ludicrous, right? How does something like this fold? It folds because of what? It was soft and it collided with something. It was pushed into that position, right? And again, this is what hydroplate would go off and explain, that when Noah basically lands here, whoops, page up, right here, when he lands on this, something is happening under the water. And what's happening is the formation of the mountain ranges that we see today.
When all you have is a hammer, everything becomes a nail, and that's the way they think about it.
That's the way they think about
That
it.
has to be, right?
That's right, because that's all we got. If I'm going to throw this out as myth and legend, then what am I left with as a causative force? 8, 13, and 14, in the 601st year, on the first of the month, on the first day of the month. Again, do you want to? I mean, there's no more better documented section of scripture from a timing perspective than Genesis 6, 7, 8. The water that had covered the earth was dried up. Noah removed the ark's cover, saw the surface of the ground was drying. By the 27th day of the second month, the earth was dry. You add this all up, Noah and his family had been in the ark for more than a year. They spent 150 days bobbing on the ocean, and all the rest of the time basically grounded on Mount Ararat, waiting for the geological processes to run their course underneath them. With that, as a brief introduction, I want to share with you this, and then we will wrap up.
According to hydroplate theory, before the flood, Earth's diameter was slightly larger than today, and its core was not liquid. You probably notice after reading the flood account that months are tracked in exactly 30-day increments. This is common among ancient cultures. In fact, most held to a 30-day month and a 12-month 360-day year. It is curious why they all chose the number 360 if a year has always been 365 and a quarter days. However, if, as the Genesis flood shows, all these cultures were descended from Noah and his sons, then it makes sense why they would all think a year was 360 days. That is what Noah and his family knew a year to be before the flood. However, the many changes that occurred since the flood have increased Earth's spin rate. If a day was only 21 minutes longer, a year would match the ancient 360-day calendars. Because observation did not match what was assumed to be a year's time, we see that many cultures had a keen interest in tracking a year by tracking the stars. It must have been very puzzling why a year's length changed. This may be confusing, so I find this simplification helps. Instead of 360 versus 365 days a year, let's just say a year pre-flood was only 4 days long. Because the mass shifted to Earth's center, the angular momentum increased and caused the rate of spin to increase, just like our figure skater example. Note that the velocity of Earth's orbit around the sun did not change, only Earth's rate of rotation about its own spin axis. In our example, let's assume that post-flood, the rate of spin increased from 4 days to 6 days per year. As Earth's core temperature increased from shifting of materials, the mantle materials with the lowest melting point melted first. As these low melt materials became liquid, crystals of materials with higher melting points became suspended in the melt, but not for long. Gravitational settling began immediately. Dense crystals whose mass was mostly iron and nickel gravitationally settled toward Earth's center. These began forming Earth's solid core. Many of the iron crystals were magnetite. As the magnetite fell through the liquid core to Earth's center, these magnetic crystals were free to align with Earth's magnetic field. This is why Earth's magnetic field is now so strong, and also why seismic waves pass through the core faster when traveling along Earth's magnetic poles than they do when passing in a perpendicular direction. Because the settling magnetic crystals were free to align and tended to align in the same direction, the inner core grew to become a giant magnetic iron-nickel crystal. Unmelted material in the magma, which was less dense than the magma, floated away from Earth's center and rose up until it contacted the bottom of the remaining solid mantle. This slurry mixture of magma-filled sediments became the ultra-low velocity D double prime zone at the base of the mantle, where seismic waves cannot travel quickly through the matrix of both solids and liquid. Because most magma produced was well below the crossover depth, it was compressed to 50% of its original volume. Because of this, Earth's radius has been reduced since the flood. Today, the Earth's average radius is 180 miles less than it was before the flood. The mantle and crust were forced to compress, causing further buckling at the surface, forming additional mountains as Earth's volume decreased like the wrinkled skin of a drying apple. Now that all this has been explained step by step, and by now you've heard and seen much of the explanation
Which you
and the main
can
points
go
of
and
the
spend time
hydroplate
looking
theory,
at. I
we
suggest
can now
it.
look at an animation which shows almost everything happening in time. Again, Earth's gravity is the primary driver. This short animation begins as the plates have first split. The sides are eroded away by the fountains. Some critics claim the hydroplates could not have slid because they would have run into each other. Here you can see the erosion of the plates left plenty of room for the initial movement because the perimeters were eroded by several hundred miles on both sides of the crack. Next, the floor of the mantle buckled up, forming the mid-oceanic ridge beginning in the Atlantic. This lifted the African and American plates as the Atlantic seafloor rose up. Material sheared deep in the earth as the Atlantic floor rose. Near the core, even microscopic movements caused surfaces to melt. The deeper this occurred, the more and more adjacent material also sheared and melted. By the time this reached the Western Pacific, the region of shear and subsidence spanned a wide area, and the entire Pacific plate collapsed and subsided with the fractured mantle as it shifted toward the rising Atlantic floor. This continued and intensified as melted materials in Earth's core contracted, slipped, and melted in a runaway process. Of course, contraction of the core caused contraction of the mantle as well. So while the Atlantic floor was pushing up on the Eurasian, African, and American plates, the mantle was contracting and falling away on the opposite edge of the plate. The plates easily slid down and away from the rising ridge on the remaining lubricating water. The rapid movement soon ceased as plates ran out of water and ground into the dry rock of the mantle, crushed and buckled up, forming compressed mountain chains. while melting much of the rock between the sliding surfaces. Now we can see a second reason the plates could more freely drift. Most of the Pacific plate was pulled down out of the way. The collapsed plate had so many fractures that magma rising from the heavily faulted mantle below spilled out on top of and covered it. So the Pacific plate was pulled down and buried in basaltic magma at the same time. Some 40,000 seamounts formed in the western Pacific above the many fractures. Heat from this magma warmed the oceans for centuries, providing the necessary conditions, along with high continents that had yet to sink into the mantle, to actually start and maintain Earth's only actual ice age. Once these required conditions ebbed, the ice age also ceased. As the core melted and contracted, Earth's volume was reduced by about 180 miles radially. Unmelted sediments in the core settle gravitationally as well, which form the iron-nickel solid inner core and the slushy ultra-low velocity D double prime layer at the mantle's base. Let's replay once more to view all at once.
All of this is happening during the first 150 days. This then is right around the 150th day, and this buckling, they would propose, happens in a single day, not because of physics, but because of Genesis 8, 1 through 4.
And the commentator is a robot.
He is a robot. Now, pay attention, because this is our recap of today.
Hydroplate theory. The flood begins on the 17th of the second month of Noah's 600th year, with the catastrophic rupture of Earth's granitic shell. Deep interconnected chambers of water burst out as great fountains from the deep. Heavy rain falls from the fountains for 40 straight days, then suddenly stops even though the waters continue rising. In the early stages after the rupture, some regions of Earth are buried in supercold hail and muck, trapping, freezing, and preserving mammoths and many other plants and animals. At the same time, Earth's hydroplates are fluttering from the powerful horizontal flow of the ocean of escaping water below. The resulting pressure waves in the granite's quartz produces huge voltages which arc within, producing focused nuclear fusion and fission events, which birth Earth's heavy radioactive elements. The chaotic environment filled with many high-speed subatomic particles bombard the new, fragile heavy nuclei, greatly accelerating their decay rates. The heat generated greatly accelerates the flow of the escaping fountains. Some materials swept up in the violent hypersonic flow of the pulsing fountains are accelerated to such high speeds that they escape Earth's gravitation. An ocean of water, rocks, minerals, gases, dust, and organic remnants are blasted from Earth into the solar system, eventually becoming what are now observed as comets, asteroids, meteoroids, and trans-Neptunian objects. Floodwaters continue to rise even though the rains have stopped. As subterranean waters continue to escape from below, plants and animals are buried in the muddy waters and eroded sediments. Repeated liquefaction of sediments produces stratified layers in which buried animals and plants are sorted into a sequence that some today mistakenly claim was produced by millions of years of evolution. After about 150 days, the hydroplate's perimeters have been eroded hundreds of miles and have thinned, forming continental shelves and slopes. The mantle floor can no longer support the imbalance from the missing material and bulges up, producing the mid-oceanic ridge. Rapid continental drift begins as plates slide away from the rising mantle floor. Soon the plates crash into the mantle floor as they run out of the lubricating water below. The compression event crushed and thickened the hydroplates and formed mountain chains. As that land thickened and rose, the floodwaters drained into very deep ocean basins. Much of the world's buried plant life is compressed and heated, forming many coal and oil deposits. The big roll of Earth's surface begins. After 150 days, the ark comes to rest on a newly formed mountain rising out of the waters. Meanwhile, the rising Atlantic seafloor causes shearing far below, and Earth's core begins melting and contracting as it extrudes toward the rising Atlantic. The Pacific hydroplate on the opposite side of Earth is pulled deep down under miles of rising magma, which is expanding up from the crossover density boundary. The Pacific seafloor is then covered in volcanic seamounts. A great wind is observed as the atmosphere adjusts to the subsiding Pacific plate, and ocean trenches are produced by the deformations. For centuries afterward, heat from the rising magma warms the oceans, greatly increasing evaporation rates. That, in combination with the newly formed continents yet to fully sink into the mantle, caused Earth's first and only ice age. 74 days after landing on Mount Ararat, surrounding mountains finally become visible. Noah begins sending birds out in regular 7-day intervals, observing their behavior. After 314 days since the flood, land is fully visible. Noah uncovers the ark. Apparently conditions are still too unstable to exit. Finally, 57 days later, after 371 days since the rupture, the land is dry and stable enough for all to exit the ark. Unbeknownst to Noah's family, the melting inner earth is gradually increasing Earth's spin rate. The 360-day calendar they've used to chronologically track these events will soon be obsolete and confuse many generations of their offspring. As the newly formed mountains slowly settle into the mantle, frictional heating melts rock, generating magma. The magma is then injected under the adjacent crust, causing the weakest portions of the crust to fracture and rise to become plateaus. As the thickened continents sink into the mantle, the initially deep ocean floors rise to today's level in compensation for the downward flow of mass. Of course, sea levels rose with the ocean floors, and the continents were divided by water in the days of Peleg. That concludes this overview presentation of hydroplate theory. Hopefully this has been helpful in bringing visual clarity to some topics.
You promised you weren't gonna have us watch any of that.
Would have been more helpful if you were a little bit more engaging. But the animation tells the story. So with that, again, the destruction of all flesh outside the ark. Again, it's an active work of God and the original creation undone. It harkens us back to, like we said, Genesis 1:2. Of course, the flood foreshadows a future event when wickedness will be swept away by the judgment of fire. And I would suggest, go back in particular, that judgment is a preview of what we'll see before the kingdom comes in. Matthew 24:36-44 is a good example of that. So with that, we'll pick up the story, having understood the mechanism. We'll pick up the rest of the story next week and keep setting ourselves up for the Tower of Babel.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Let's real quick prayer. Thank you, Father. I appreciate the fact that you give us clues to how you work. And again, it should strengthen our faith in you. And again, you're able to do these things. Saving us is not too great for you. In your sense, Nate. Amen.
That is not the correct next week, right?
No, it's not. Sorry about that.
Going back.